Good morning and welcome to you all. My name is Kathy Schill. I'm a fiscal analyst in the Minnesota House of Representatives, and I welcome you today to this session entitled, What Happened to the American Dream? I would like to remind everyone that this is a live stream recorded session, and so if you have one of these devices close by that beeps or buzzes, could you please put it on stun? That will make things go a little bit better. We are glad that you chose to be here this morning, the first session of the day, to talk about the American dream over other sessions in this time slot. Maybe to start this session, we should pick a favorite song about the American dream. For you boomers out there, the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band had such a song. Or for something more contemporary, check out MKTO on YouTube. They've got a great song as well. But hang on, we've got something else in mind. This session will last for approximately 75 minutes. We are excited to have two dynamic presenters with us, each of whom will speak about 15 to 20 minutes. In addition, we'll be seeking your input, yes, audience participation in real time, through the use of Poll Everywhere. When I ask a question, we'd like for each of you to text an answer to 22333, and then your collective responses will show up on the screen. Last, there will be about a 20-minute Q&A time, but let's try our poll everywhere. And so we'll go to the very first question, which is, what are the defining qualities of the American dream? Please respond in one or two words, and it'll create a word wall up on the screen. Here we go. Yes. Make sure you enter the poll everywhere using NCSL Fenway. There we go. Well, someone did that right. You must have already been entered. And if you need assistance in getting into Poll Everywhere, please raise your hand and we can have someone come by and help. So defining qualities of the American dream. I'm seeing mobility, economic mobility, possibility, opportunity, financial freedom, improvement. Hope and kids, that's great. Okay, let's try this next. We have a few questions here, and these are easier. They are either agree or disagree. The next question that we have is this. Children born in the 1980s have a higher chance of earning more than their parents. Either agree or disagree. Okay. The next question that we have for you is, do you agree or disagree to this statement? Today is the golden age of the startup. The agrees seem to be trending 2-1. The next is, Americans today are more likely to move across state lines than did their parents. And we're at about 3-1. Agreed. Okay, and the final question is, location influences a person's access to opportunity. I either agree or disagree. And most people are responding agree. Well, hold on to those thoughts because we are about to explore the American dream. Actually, the American dream was first outlined here in Boston on July 18, 1776, from the balcony of the Old State House, when Colonel Thomas Crafts read the Declaration of Independence proclaiming that, among other things, all men are created equal, with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For each of us, the American dream may mean different things. Some have learned the dream to be that if you work hard, you can live a happy and prosperous life. Others have envisioned the dream to provide equal access to opportunity. Most would agree that it is the ideal that any American can reach an economic stability through hard work, and that children have a higher standard of living than that of their parents. However, researchers at Stanford and Harvard have found that this no longer holds true today. Just 46% of 30-year-olds today are making more in real terms than their parents did at age 30. Additionally, research from the Economic Innovation Group finds that economic dynamism, or the rate of churn in the American economy, is at an all-time low, having serious implications for our local and state economic vitality. The goal of this session is to, number one, to explore the impacts of the changing landscape that is the backdrop of the American dream. Two, to examine the implications of research findings relative to our business, workforce, and education systems. And three, to brainstorm policy options for state legislatures. What actions would help to broaden, not limit, access to the American dream? We have two speakers today. Robert Manduca is a PhD student in sociology and social policy at Harvard University. His research focuses on regional economic development and the implications of changing income distribution for people, cities, and regions. Through the Equality of Opportunity Project, Robert is a co-author, along with Raj Chetty, David Gruski, and Maximilian Hell of Stanford, Nathaniel Hedren of Harvard, and Jimmy Narang of UC Berkeley, of the newly released paper, The Fading American Dream: Trends in Absolute Income Mobility Since 1940. He is also native of Rochester, Minnesota, my home state. And additionally, we have Kenan Fikri, who serves as the manager for research and policy development for the Economic Innovation Group, a bipartisan public policy organization that combines innovative research and data-driven advocacy to address America's most pressing economic challenges. Prior to joining EIG, Kenan was a senior policy analyst and associate fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program. There, he was responsible for conceptualizing and executing a wide array of economic research and policy projects. An expert in place-based economic analysis, Kenan has also considerable experience advising state and local officials on economic development and regional competitiveness strategies. Kenan has also served as a consultant with the World Bank Groups of Competitive Cities team. And Kenan has obtained his master's degree in local economic development from the London School of Economics and his bachelor's in international relations and economics at American University. I will now pass the microphone to Robert, who will start with his presentation.
All right. Thank you, Kathy, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming and for having me. I'm really excited to be here at NCSL. So, as was mentioned, I'm going to be talking about economic mobility and the American dream. And we already got some of your input on what is the American dream, but that's sort of the question that my co-authors and I have been interested in and are trying to study. I thought I would start the presentation by bringing in some authorities, and specifically some recent presidents, to look at what they've said about the American dream. And so starting with Ronald Reagan, this is a quote from his announcement of presidential candidacy in 1979. And so when he's telling people why he was running for president, he said, you know, people these days, they tell us that we must learn to live with less and teach our children that their lives will be less full and less prosperous than ours have been, and I don't believe that, and that's why I'm running for president. So he's, you know, very concerned that that it's becoming accepted that children might grow up to have a lower standard of living than their parents, and that's what he wants to fix by running for president when he declared. Moving forward a bit, we have Bill Clinton speaking on Labor Day in 1993. He's describing the American ideals that were instilled in us by our parents, and one of those is that if you work hard and play by the rules, you should be rewarded with a good life for yourself and a better chance for your children. You know, the American dream has always been a better life for people who are willing to work for it. And then finally, a quote from Barack Obama, who's speaking to some of the frustrations, the economic frustrations that people have started to feel in recent years. And he's saying that these frustrations are rooted in the fear that people's kids won't be better off than they were, and that America's basic bargain, which is that if you work hard, you have a chance to get ahead, is no longer coming true as much as it once was. So looking at these quotes from these presidents of both parties, I think, you know, my co-authors and I, we would agree with them, and we think that what they're getting at is this idea of economic mobility that we think is central to the American dream. So the United States either is or people think should be a place where everyone should have the chance to move up economically if they work for it, and where if you play by the rules, your kids should grow up to be materially better off than you were. You know, we think of this in slogans like the land of opportunity, right? America's the land of opportunity, or the place where you can get a better life for your children. That's often what brings people to our shores. When we talk about economic mobility, there's two different concepts that I think both of which are important, but I want to distinguish here. So we can talk about relative economic mobility and absolute economic mobility. So relative mobility is, until recently, what's drawn most attention from analysts and from social scientists. And this is mobility in rank terms. And basically, this is measuring the extent to which children who are born to poor parents can grow up to become rich. So it's measuring equality of opportunity, essentially, the extent to which people are able to rise beyond their situations of birth and achieve prosperity. You can think of this as a measure of how open or how fluid a society is, the extent to which, you know, anyone can achieve their dreams or anyone can rise to the top. But one caveat about it, or one thing to bear in mind, is that relative mobility is zero-sum. So if we're talking about mobility in rank terms, you know, every time one person moves up in rank, somebody else is going to move down. That's just how arithmetically it works. Or you can think of this also, if you're thinking about, you know, the top 1% or something like that, only 1% of people can be in the top 1%. So it's zero-sum. The other type of absolute mobility that's important to study is absolute mobility. So this is mobility in dollar terms, and this is basically measuring the extent to which children grow up to be better off than their parents were in terms of their overall income. So how much money they're making, their material standard of living, these sorts of things. So rather than measuring how open or fluid a society is, it's measuring how the extent to which, on the whole, that society is becoming more prosperous, and the extent to which that prosperity is broadly shared. So, you know, is everyone moving up or not, or what percentage of people are moving up over time? And unlike relative mobility, absolute mobility is not zero-sum, right? Because everyone, you know, if there's broadly shared economic growth, it's possible for literally every single person in the country to do better than their parents did if the economy is growing or moving in the right direction. To help you visualize these two concepts, we have illustrations. So when economists and sociologists talk about mobility, we often like to use metaphor of ladders, and you can think of people occupying different rungs on a ladder associated with different positions in the income distribution. So when you think of relative mobility, this is the picture that I at least try to have in mind. And so this is measuring the extent to which people are changing rungs on the economic ladder. So you can see that, you know, if the ladder on the left represents parents and the one on the right represents children, you can see that in this case, case, there's a fair amount of relative mobility. Some people have moved up to higher rungs, other people have moved down, and some people stay the same. So there's been a shuffling of positions on this economic ladder. In contrast, absolute mobility is better represented by this illustration. So here again, if you have the left representing parents and the right representing children, you can see that there's no reshuffling of ranks. Everybody's on the exact same rung that they started, but the entire ladder has moved up such that every single child is better off in real terms or in absolute terms than their parents were. So I think both of these measures are very important, and they measure different things about societies, but they're distinct, and it's important not to confuse them. Okay, so why do we care about mobility? Well, I would argue that we care about both types of mobility just in and of themselves, that they're measures of sort of the societal health of a country or of a society. But in particular, there are also more instrumental reasons to care about absolute mobility especially. So there's been some very interesting historical and psychological research, and that suggests that societies with higher absolute mobility are better places to live in a lot of ways. So you can think of these, they tend to be more open, more tolerant, more generous, more pragmatic, more committed to fairness, and even more committed to democracy. So these are places where, on a broad level, most people's incomes are rising over time, and they tend to be nicer places to live, and even better along a lot of different metrics that are pretty widely agreed upon. All right, so now I'm going to tell you about two studies that have come out of the Equality of Opportunity Project. The first one is one that I contributed to, and the second one is one that was done by some of my co-authors that look at absolute and relative mobility in recent years. So the first study is the one that we heard about earlier, and this is looking at trends in absolute mobility over the last 70 years or so. And the question we were asking, my co-authors and I, was basically what percentage of children grow up to be materially better off than their parents were at the same age, and how has this changed over the last 70 years? And to answer this question, we combine several different data sets, but the comparison that we're doing is basically asking, after adjusting for inflation, we look at the family incomes of children when they're about 30 years old, and we compare them to the family incomes, the real family incomes of their parents also at age 30. And we're asking what fraction of children had higher incomes at age 30 than their parents did. And what we see when we look at this, this is the result for 1940. And so the way to read these graphs is across the bottom, I have put parent income percentile. So going from the left is the poorest parents, and the right is the richest parents, dividing it into 100 percentiles. And on the vertical axis is the percentage of children who grew up to be better off than their parents were. So what you can see in 1940 is that across almost all of the income distribution, up till at least the 80th or 90th percentile, more than 90%, about 90% of children grew up to be materially better off than their parents. At the very top of the income distribution, that number falls a bit, and you can think of this is because if you are born to the single richest person, for example, in the country, then in order to earn more than them, you both have to experience economic growth, and you have to stay on the top. You can't slide down in relative terms at all, so that's why those numbers are lower. But essentially, for the year 1940, almost all children grew up to be better off than their parents. If we play this forward, we can see, so in 1950, it started to decline a little bit, especially sort of in the top half or so. 1960, it declines quite a bit more. 1970, it holds a little bit steady, only a small decline. And then finally, for people who were born in 1980, so people who turned 30 in 2010, you can see that it's declined by almost half. It's much lower than it used to be. And that the decline has been largest for the middle class. This is just looking at the same data. This is a trend year by year showing the overall absolute mobility rate. And basically the finding is that, in people born in the 1940s, about 90% of them grew up to be better off than their parents. There's a very steady decline over the following 25, 30 years. And a slight upswing for people born in the late 60s. These were people who turned 30 in the late 90s during the economic boom then, and then it's continued to slide since then, to the point where people who were born in the early 80s have about almost exactly a 50% chance of doing better than their parents, so basically a coin flip. We were trying to be good social scientists, so we did a lot of sensitivity analyses with this, and we basically find that the key result that there's been a very sharp decline is extremely robust. So it's robust to using different measures of inflation, looking at income after taxes and after transfers, measuring income at age 40 rather than 30, using individual income rather than family income, and adjusting for changes in household size. So these alter the final rate, especially for later cohorts, but they don't alter the trend hardly at all. Okay, and then so the question that we might be asking is, what's behind this decline in absolute mobility? And I don't have time to get into the methods we use, but I'm happy to discuss that during the Q&A. But basically, as far as we can tell, it looks like the decline in absolute mobility is primarily due to wage stagnation since the 1970s. So about 30% of the decline is due to slower economic growth. So the economy grew more quickly in the 1950s and the 1960s than it has in recent decades. But much more important than that, about 70% of the decline is due to the fact that incomes have not kept up with the economic growth that we've had. So you can think of this also as, rising income inequality. And this was actually the subject. Some of you may have seen this article in the New York Times, I think Monday or Tuesday or yesterday, a recent article exploring this exact question. So the title of the article is "Our Broken Economy in One Simple Chart." And what that chart shows is it looks at the income growth rate over the previous 30 years or 34 years by income percentile. And if you look at the gray series, it's doing this for the 34 years up to 1980 and then the 34 years up to 2014. And what you see is if you look at the series in gray, which is looking at the 30 years leading up to 1980, you see that, first of all, the income growth was high. It was about 2% on average, but it was also very broadly shared. So it was high for almost everyone. And in fact, it was highest for the people who started out poorest. This meant that the entire society was getting richer, and that even as everyone was getting richer, the people who had started out at the bottom were catching up to everyone else. And that's very different from the picture that you see in 2014, which is in red. So here, you can see that the overall rate is lower. It's about 1.4% on average compared to 2%. But it's also much more skewed. So the people at the very top, they highlight the 99.999th percent, which I think is about the 3,000 richest people in the country, something like that. Their incomes have grown on average 6% a year for the past 34 years. So I tried to do the calculation. It's something they've grown by something like 5 to 600% during a time in which the overall economy has only grown by about 50%. So the economic growth that we have had has been very skewed towards the wealthy. So that gives you a sense of how you can have incomes failing to keep up with economic growth. All right, so just summing up the first study, so basically there are two main takeaways. So one, rates of upward absolute mobility have fallen from about 90% for people born in the 1940 birth cohort to about 50% for young adults today. And second, this is primarily due to wage stagnation since the 1970s. All right, now I want to talk briefly about a second study. This is not one that I contributed to, so I'm going to do my best, looking at the geography of relative mobility. It's called "Where is the Land of Opportunity?" They're clever with titles, I think. So if you'll recall, relative mobility is mobility in rank terms, so looking at where you versus your parents are in the income distribution in percentiles. And this graph shows relative mobility for the overall for the United States for the cohort born in 1980 to 1982, so a couple birth cohorts combined. This is based off of linked IRS tax data. And what you see is, so the way to read this graph is across the bottom you have the parent income rank from 0 to 100 in percentile terms, and then on the y-axis you have the average rank of children born to parents in that percentile. And so if there were perfect relative mobility, this would be a flat line. It would be 50 for everyone. And if there were zero relative mobility, then it would be a 45-degree line with a slope of 1. So where your parents' income exactly determines your own income rank. And the empirical result for the US is that there's a slope of about 0.35. So that means that for every extra percentile up in the income distribution a parent is, their children on average are about a third of a percentile richer. So the difference between being born to somebody at the 60th rather than the 50th percentile is about 3 percentile ranks. However, this varies a lot across the country. So these are two lines showing the relative mobility rates for Salt Lake City in blue and Charlotte in red. And you can see that the Salt Lake City line is is quite a bit flatter than the line for Charlotte. And this indicates that relative mobility is substantially higher in Salt Lake than it is in Charlotte. And it's a meaningful difference. So if you think of the average child born to a parent at the 25th percentile, so the bottom quarter of society, in Salt Lake, those kids end up on average at the 46th percentile, so almost at the median of the country, whereas in Charlotte, they end up at about the 35th percentile, so about a third lower, a third smaller in terms of the mobility that they experience. Okay, and so the question is that these researchers are interested in, that I think many people should be interested in, is the extent to which that is a causal effect. So is that because, you can imagine that it's because different types of people live in these different places, and maybe even at the same income level, people who live in Salt Lake might be more likely to be upwardly mobile. Or you could imagine that there is an effect of living in a given place, and that if you took somebody at random and dropped them in Salt Lake or in Minneapolis or wherever, that affects their chances of moving up. And basically, these researchers determined, using a lot of very impressive and advanced statistical and social science modeling, they determined that much of this is actually a causal effect. So I'm going to just show you what the map looks like. So they were able to estimate the causal effect of growing up in different parts of the country. And what they show is that if you look at this map, there's wide geographic variation. And so this is showing light colors are areas that have higher upward relative mobility or higher relative mobility, and dark areas have lower relative mobility. And so they've estimated that on average, the effect of growing up somewhere like Minnesota or Nebraska, Wyoming, these sorts of places that are white, that are lightly colored, they have on average, if you took a child at random and had them grow up there, they would on average earn about 20% more than the average child with their background in the country. And then conversely, the places that are more red colored on this map, so some of the places are, many parts of Mississippi, many parts of North Carolina, including Charlotte, as we saw, also Chicago, also parts of California. Those children growing up there, on average, earn about 9% or 10% less than their peers in the country as a whole. So there's, this is fairly substantial variation and, economically meaningful, certainly. And then what they did is they looked at what sorts of variables predict the extent to which a commuting zone or a metro area has upward or downward mobility, or has more or less relative mobility. And so the way to look at this chart is basically they're looking at a one standard deviation change in a given metric. So this first one is a common index of racial segregation within a metro area, and they're showing that a one standard deviation increase in racial segregation decreases relative mobility on average by about 5%. And they do this for a bunch of different variables of interest. So some takeaways are that places with shorter commute times tend to have higher relative mobility. Metro areas that are more unequal tend to have lower relative mobility. Places with higher test scores and with more colleges tend to do better, and so on down the line. Also, places with they use an index of social capital, which looks at things like the percentage of people who go to church and the extent to which people are involved in various types of civic organizations. They find that is very predictive of high relative mobility. All right, so that's all I have for you prepared. I want to thank you all very much for your attention and for coming. Feel free to email me. My email's up here, and also all the slides and all of the data that I've showed you is available online at www.equalityofopportunity.org. So thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, we do have a set-aside time for Q&A, but I wanted to give a quick opportunity, maybe one or two questions, if there were questions related to any of the slides that he put up. And yes, sir, I see one question down here. Could you come to the microphone, please, so we can all hear it?
A question, and it was actually something I saw like in a point-counterpoint op-ed in one of the newspapers. One of the factors that you didn't adjust for is purchasing power. So that's very complicated. So we have the suppression of wage growth because of foreign competition, but lower cost of clothes, electronics. So how do you then really evaluate people's standards of living? You adjust for inflation, but how about purchasing power?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and something that we had to spend a lot of time trying to think about. And I'll tell you what we've done, and then some of the potential weaknesses. So there are two sort of related issues that you're bringing up. So one is sort of overall purchasing power and the fact that you can buy more on a given income now than you could in the past, perhaps, or something like that. And I think we've done, I think, a fairly thorough job of controlling for that by using many different measures of inflation for the country as a whole. So in the Q&A, I can show you some of the different measures that we have. But we've used every one that's common in the literature, and then we've done ones where we add, say, well, what if inflation was, just 2 percentage points a year lower, just to be sure. But the second question is differences in purchasing power across the country. So you can think of things like the cost of living in Boston, for example, is much higher than the cost of living in Minnesota, where I grew up. And that's true in housing, but it's also true for different types of goods, and we can't really control for that. So you could imagine that these numbers might be overstated a bit if more people today live in low-cost areas or a higher fraction of the overall population lives in low-cost parts of the country than was true in the past. I think it's very messy to try to sort that out because there's not super well agreed upon measures of purchasing power, and even with things like housing, people say, well, part of the reason it's expensive in certain places to live is that you're getting higher amenity values. Maybe people value the weather there, that sort of stuff. So I think it's very hard to sort of analytically sort that out, but that is a potential concern.
Good morning, thank you.
Yes, one more.
Mark Meek from Oregon. And related to the relative mobility, and as we've seen over the last 30 to 40 years, the middle class has shrunk. How is, I don't understand if somebody's moving upward, that it seems like the latter has been moving down then in the absolute relativity.
Yeah. So so relative mobility is just looking at, again, if you're thinking of the ladder, looking at how many people are changing rungs, but it doesn't speak to whether that ladder as a whole is moving up and down or whether it's stretching out. So what's happened is that the being on the top rungs has gone up quite a bit, even as the rest of the ladder has sort of stayed put or even slid down a little bit, and that's not covered in the relative mobility terms. So basically, if you look at trends in relative mobility, which is a different paper that they did that I haven't had a chance to talk about, but basically trends in relative mobility have been fairly constant, but what that means in absolute terms has changed.
Okay, I'll take one more here, and then I'll ask for the others to hold on for the Q&A session. Please, your state, please, and your name.
My state is Charlotte. I'm from North Carolina, but specifically Charlotte, North Carolina. It's interesting, the comparison that you made with Charlotte, North Carolina, Salt Lake City, Utah. Would there be a fair assumption that when you compare those two, Charlotte started off all lower in economic mobility, and it's intergenerational as compared to Salt Lake City?
So I can't really speak to change it to trends in mobility for specific places over time, but it may certainly be the case that, so when I was quoting the statistics, those were comparing two children who are at the same percentile of the national income distribution. But it's quite possible that different cities have different percentages of kids that fall in different places. So it may be that there are more people starting lower in the national income distribution in Charlotte than Salt Lake, for example. And you can imagine that would affect the upward mobility rates from a given percentile.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Thank you. And now we will turn to Kenan with his presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, NCSL, for asking me to present today and have the opportunity to show you our research. Let me switch the slides. I also have a whole bunch of depressing statistics, so we'll have to make sure to end on an optimistic note.
There we go.
Okay. And there we go. Okay, almost there. Yes, perfect. Okay. So I won't introduce myself any further. I'll just jump right in. So the American dream is inextricably connected to the American economy writ large. A dynamic, changeful, ever-growing economy is supposed to be part of the American story. Ideas and ambition are supposed to be all it takes to get ahead. And we like to think of ourselves as the most dynamic and entrepreneurial nation on earth. So the trends that Robert documented towards a less dynamic society are paralleled with and inextricably, or paralleled by and inextricably kind of bound up with trends towards a less dynamic economy. So people seem to think that the economy today is plagued by too much disruption and too much change that's leaving people behind. But I think that that's not quite right. That's a false impression that some really high-profile, mostly technology, internet-based companies out of Silicon Valley have kind of made pervade the ether. What we're actually experiencing is an economy that's seeing too little change and an economy that's growing too static, and that has impacts on individual economic mobility as well. So I'll walk you through some of those trends that we're seeing to document the case. So first, the US economy is growing less dynamic in really any way that you define the term. So people are moving less often than in the past. The rate of kind of moving across state boundaries has halved since the 1980s. People are changing jobs less frequently too. So in 2015, only 1 in 14 positions in the economy turned over that year. And that means that fewer people are moving to kind of higher wage, productivity enhancing work arrangements. And it also means that there are fewer kind of chain reactions of job hoppers working their way through the economy. And at the end of every one of those chains is typically an individual on the margins of the labor force, a young person or someone who's unemployed looking for an opening to step into. And those aren't appearing like they used to. So the word entrepreneurship wasn't up there on the American Dream, or one word in American Dream word cloud thing, but I think it probably should have been. And the declining startup rate itself, I believe, is kind of at the core of the nationwide and economy-wide trend towards declining dynamism. So the United States today produces half as many new companies as a share of all companies in the economy that it did in the late 1970s. And in the 1980s, the economy was half as large as it is today, but each and every year we produced about 500,000 new companies in the US economy. Since 2010, that number's fallen to 400,000 new companies. And again, that's in an economy that's twice as large as just a few decades ago. So if you look at these trend lines, what changed, or the Great Recession really marks a turning point. The top line is the startup rate, the bottom line is the rate at which firms close. And the Great Recession is the first time that those two lines crossed. And that actually represents a bit of a transformation. So for the first time in the United States, more companies closed than opened in any given year. And it's important to remember as you're thinking about these trends that apart from a spike in 2009, the closure rate has not increased. So despite the retail apocalypse and manufacturing troubles throughout the economy, what's really underlying this transformation that we're seeing is that new companies are coming online at a far slower rate than ever before. They're not dying faster. And startups are such a vital replenishing force in the economy for several reasons. One, they are more likely to be innovative than incumbent firms, and they innovate in a kind of fundamentally different way. Two, they're more likely to pioneer new business models. In any given year, startups account for almost all of net job growth in the economy. Existing firms shed as many workers as jobs that they create in most years. They keep competition intense, and they nudge existing firms to do better, and that process increases productivity growth. And really most importantly, they are the actors that create the industries and the jobs of the future. And as we're seeing fewer of those, we're seeing fewer jobs and companies and industries of the future come online. So one more thing I'd like to say on this slide. So if you'd have one takeaway from this session, I'd like it to be that the policy imperative is to boost the startup rate back towards where it used to be. And that is going to call for a fundamentally different set of policies proposals than if you instead wanted to batten down the hatches and say you want to insulate your economy from waves of economic change. So this chart essentially shows in a different way the gap between those two lines on the previous page. It shows the net annual increase in firms in the US economy each year. And you can see that the Great Recession really knocked the country's startup engine almost completely inert. And now it's a huge transformation that we're barely producing a new company for every one that closes in the United States today. So these are uncharted waters. Now, here are my beginnings as a geographer are going to show through. So these national trends are, of course, the aggregation of things happening place by place across the United States today. So this chart shows the number of metropolitan areas in the U.S. that, or in which more firms are closing than opening in any given year. So prior to the Great Recession, that never really rose above 20% of metro areas. Totally spiked with the Great Recession, and it's stayed elevated ever since. So now about 60% of metro areas. The latest data is for 2014. But even then, 5 years into a recovery, we're still kind of suffering from eroding portfolios of companies and their local economies. And again, I want to reinforce that this trend is not driven by closures, it's driven by depressed startup rates, and it's not just retail that's driving these trends. So this graphic shows visually kind of the transformation that's set in across metropolitan America. So each dot here represents a metro area, and the y-axis is the startup rate over the average over different 5-year periods, reflecting equivalent, points on recovery cycles. And the bottom axis is the firm closure rate. And it used to be that almost all places in the U.S. were experiencing expansion. They were above that 45-degree line, above which more companies are opening than closing. And then as the startup rate has fallen steadily over time, the whole cohort has shifted downwards, and then it reached a crisis point in the Great Recession where, for the first time, most places were kind of underwater in this sense. So the startup rate is only one metric, but I've dwelled on it so long because I think it has incredible symbolic importance and explanatory power as we try to dig into what happened to the American dream. And this is because you can just look at the impacts that startups have on various aspects of the economy. So for workers, a less dynamic economy means that there are fewer companies out there competing for their labor. It means that there are fewer opportunities to switch jobs and find someone offering that higher wage. And it essentially means that there are fewer chances to climb the ladder of opportunity that Robert was documenting. So for markets, it means that a less dynamic economy means that markets and industries are becoming more concentrated. So since 1997, 2/3 of U.S. industries have become more dominated by the most dominant firms in their markets. So competition is weakening in the economy, and profits are sky high. We see this reflected in the Dow, and we see this reflected in all sorts of economic statistics. But especially in the past year, a whole bunch of research has come online that says that these are not profits that are generated from genuine innovations, or they're not tied to patents or intellectual property. They're tied towards barriers to entry, towards economic rents, and kind of undue market power because markets have fundamentally transformed and are less dynamic and competitive. So for regions, a less dynamic economy it means that they suffer as well. It means that the pipeline of new businesses that's supposed to be populating the map is drying up. It means that there's less experimentation going on all across the country, where entrepreneurs are trying to find the new industries of the future. And it also, I think, contributes to a relatively backward-looking economic development stance in too many places, where if in an era of diminished dynamism, you're left kind of fighting over just a scarce number of pieces on the chessboard in a relatively zero-sum game. Either I get the one plant that's being cited this year, or another state does. And that stands in contrast to a more future-oriented economic development stance, where you're trying to cultivate and nurture the industries of the future. So instead, trying to preserve the past as long as possible. So to paint a more complete picture than just the startup rate, we at EIG wanted to create an index of multiple measures of dynamism and track them across states and over time. So data availability meant that 1992 to 2014 was the period that we looked at. We weighted all the 7 metrics there equally, except the first one, business churn, which combines the startup rate and the closure rate into kind of a single gauge of churn in the business landscape, and that one we weighted doubly. And here you can see the results. The darker states are the most dynamic ones. They're the highest performing quintile, and the lighter states are the least dynamic ones. So Nevada, Utah, Florida, California, and North Dakota lead the pack. And these states are all high population growth states, and it's kind of intuitive that faster population growth means that you're creating new businesses to serve a growing market. but they also have high foreign-born shares of the population, and immigrants are disproportionately likely to create new businesses. They're also generally economically diversified, relatively new, have knowledge economy and information tech economy sectors. So compare that to the least dynamic states, which are clustered in the Great Lakes and then kind of secondarily in the lower Mississippi River Basin. These places, despite many kind of positive stories coming out of the region, are still broadly kind of struggling with legacy industries, trying to find new economic purposes in a changing, rapidly changing environment. And these places are suffering from high rates of outmigration and very low startup rates. I would also point out that these are the states that quite conspicuously determined the 2016 election. I don't think that that is going to be completely coincidental. So some of the bad news given dynamism's pervasive decline is that the force seems to have real inertia. So on the one hand, Nevada was the state that dominated the index from start to finish, and that's despite a tech boom and bust, a housing boom and bust, financial crisis, and then a protracted recovery. So that shows that states, it takes a lot to move a state or dislodge a state on this comprehensive set of metrics. And then the graph on the bottom right, the dotted line shows the U.S. Average on the index. The copper line is North Dakota, and all the grayed lines are just all other 50 states in the background. And you can see that North Dakota is really the only one that bucked the trend. And to me, this is kind of telling how hard it is to reverse dynamism once it really starts to fade. Because North Dakota is a relatively small state in terms of population. It experienced an exceptional boom in oil and gas extraction that contributed to this. And even that once in a generation bonanza was only enough to bring the state back to its 1990s level of dynamism on these metrics. So the slightly out of order, sorry, the map at the top left shows the states that are at their lowest kind of dynamism ebb, even in 2014. That's 5 years after the Great Recession. And these, to me, kind of capture the three kind of problem areas of the economy today. You have old industrial regions, you have kind of the deep endemic poverty of the Deep South, and then you have rural places that are kind of trying to find their footing in an urban age. So as dynamism has declined, we've seen fewer and fewer places power national growth. So the share of all counties matching the national job growth rate over the past three recoveries has fallen to 28%. It used to be in the 1990s, well over half of counties were matching that top line national job growth rate. And only a quarter of counties now match the rate of increase in business establishments that the national economy is posting. So more and more of the new businesses that the economy is or does generate are concentrating in relatively large, resilient major metropolitan areas, at least through 2014, which is the latest data. So as dynamism retreats, I think the takeaway is that it becomes harder to generate inclusive growth that is going to reach more people in more places and give them opportunities for income mobility. So the American dream is realized or denied locally, where people live and work, where norms are established, on the streets and in the parks and in the schools, and the neighborhood level effects that really feed into many of the results that Robert's research teams have found are hyper-local, community by community effects. So the last major piece of research that I'd like to talk about is our Distressed Communities Index. And this maps economic well-being at the zip code level, and it's at this geographic resolution where I think that the disparities in the American economic experience really come into starkest focus. So this material is a preview of a report that is going to be forthcoming from EIG in 2017. So on the map, the darker the blue, the more prosperous the community, and the deeper the orange, the more economically distressed. So the DCI classifies the top fifth of US zip codes as prosperous and the bottom fifth as distressed. So if you look at the average values across the 7 indicators in those quintiles that constitute the DCI, you can see some really astonishing gaps even in this. This is the DCI is a relative metric, but it captures things like, in distressed communities, more than twice as many prime age adults are not in work as in prosperous communities. The poverty rate is more than 4 times as high, and more than 4 times as many adults don't even have a high school degree. And that's really the ticket to opportunity in the economy today. And then I think the most shocking and most troubling is the growth gap. So the 2 statistics on the right, change in employment and change in business establishments. So distressed communities, the places that are most desperate for growth today are the places that are still mired in a deep and ongoing recession. So it's a real challenge that I think all of us face in trying to nudge growth towards these places that, left to its own devices, it's going to leave behind. So place doesn't just affect future earnings, but it affects everything from educational attainment to life expectancy. So what we are really concerned about at EIG is that it seems like trends in the economy today are towards even further concentration of geographic opportunity. So I think it's a real crisis and moment now where we need to try to deconcentrate that. Because this trend runs counter to a very deeply ingrained sense in this country that prosperity should be broadly shared, and that zip code should not determine one's ultimate life prospects. So that motivates me in my work every day, and that makes me excited to be here with you all thinking about ways to kind of rekindle dynamism at the grassroots level, because the American dream is realized or denied neighborhood by neighborhood, and that is also where it will be restored. So thank you, and should take some questions.
Once again, I'd like to offer the opportunity for a couple of questions, if you have them, in association with Kennan's charts and graphs, and then we'll open it up to the overall Q&A. I see a question down here.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. I'm Bill McCamley, state representative from New Mexico, and I guess 2 questions. The first is specifically regarding tax policy, and I guess this could be for both of you. Are there any kind of connections you find between things like earned income tax credit, progressive income taxes, more reliance on regressivity in taxes, special breaks for big corporations in regards to inequality? And I guess the second one is more of a best practices question. So what we hear all the time in New Mexico is broadband availability, workforce training, and access to capital and finance. Are there any other, you're dealing with a bunch of policymakers here, are there any other best practices in terms of policy that can increase dynamism and decrease equality? Thank you.
Sure, those are big questions. So if I don't get to all of them now, hopefully we'll expound upon them a little more in the Q&A as well. So with respect to tax policy, I think that it's well documented and agreed upon, like on both sides of the aisle, that the EITC is a real best-in-class program that does measurably increase individual earnings. So I think that efforts to expand that and improve that are definitely worthwhile. With respect to, I think you mentioned incentives to big companies, big businesses. I think those are going to be state-by-state considerations, but you do have to look at the economics that, it is a budget, and you can either take the fraction of money towards investing in people, improving schools, improving infrastructure, improving workforce training, or you can get the immediate jobs bump. So I think that that's a kind of a balance that most people in this room are keenly aware of. And with respect to best practices, so I think we'll talk a little more about rural issues, but some really good research has come out of the Headwaters Research Institute, which is based in, it covers the Mountain West and it's based in Montana. But they looked at rural counties in the West and tried to differentiate which ones were doing well and not doing well based on different characteristics. And they found that, so connectivity, not just in broadband, but in physical transportation and air transportation, was the key differentiator between whether rural areas were thriving or not. So I think that efforts to essentially, make sure that the fabric of the economy is strong and that people who do choose to live in rural areas can access kind of the market information they need. Companies who work in rural areas can access the talent that they need, are all worthwhile. And I'll leave it there.
And I would like to give Robert an equal opportunity to answer that question if you care to. And the question was some of the state policies using earned income tax credit or regressivity or even the best practices question.
Yeah.
You can go that one. Yeah.
Okay. So I would also like to echo the point about the EITC that, yeah, I think that's pretty widely agreed upon to be a very excellent, very effective program to increase, upward mobility and decrease inequality. As far as like best practices, this isn't something that we've gotten into as much, so I don't think I can talk in as specific terms, but I would say anything that states can do to sort of encourage companies to, we just saw that companies are actually extremely profitable right now, and so anything that states can do to encourage companies to share those profits with consumers and with their workers and these sorts of things. So, profit sharing agreements, if you can encourage that in any way, cooperative ownership, these sorts of things, as well as kind of, fostering startups and fostering entrepreneurship and that sort of stuff.
Okay. Hi, Stephanie. Do you have a question related to one of the charts?
I have a specific question for, I think it's Ken's first chart, where
Yes.
the lines cross.
Yes.
Thank you. Can you tell us your state, please? Just
I'm
for the
Stephanie
record.
Bear. I'm fiscal staff in Vermont. And I couldn't quite understand the time, I couldn't see the time frame on that chart.
Oh, sure.
So I wasn't quite sure how many years that was. But my question is, when you looked at that chart and where it crossed in the Great Recession, but you'd seen it over time, I'm trying to understand, is there an understanding of how much of that change is like globalization related? And are there, just a sort of a secondary question, are there national or state policies that get at this sort of, I don't know how to describe it, the concentration that you're talking about corporately, that sort of lower competition and sort of risk protection aspects of that?
Yeah. So the time frame was 1997 is the year that data set that the Census Bureau maintains started, and it went through 2014. So that's the million-dollar question. I think, what are the different forces that underlie? There is a definite long-term decline there too. I think technology and globalization are kind of the two mega trends that I think have to factor in somehow. I think that when we look at, I think we're going to talk more about inequality, but if you look at inequality, a lot of that's driven by the superstar companies that have really mastered global supply chains, that have mastered these extremely complicated technology systems, are now seeing kind of the excess returns on those investments, and those are really hard barriers to entry, or really high barriers to entry, and really hard things for startups to replicate and be able to compete against. So I think that companies that have mastered those things have a real advantage. I also think, though, that so states can. So I think sometimes state policies do look to protect incumbents or subsidize incumbents, or there's an externality every time that a subsidy goes to an existing company that a startup is not going to share or won't have that subsidy as well. So it's going to be harder for them to compete against the other companies. So I think that a mentality in which at least all companies are treated equally or startups are treated better is kind of a good framework for states to consider adopting.
Yeah. And Robert would like to comment also.
Yeah, so I'd just like to echo a couple of these things. So it's definitely true that these, specifically globalization and technology, have been major forces affecting the economy and affecting the country and probably contributing to many of these trends. But one thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. actually, at least on the wage stagnation and inequality metrics that I'm more familiar with, the U.S. has fared substantially worse than most of our peer nations. So it can't be entirely these global changes. And one thing that many scholars scholars are looking at and think is contributing is that we've actually changed over the past 30 or 40 years. We've altered the rules by which our economy functions. So it's been sort of affirmative change in many cases. So for instance, one example of that is that's been getting a fair amount of attention in the news recently, is that the way in which the government approaches antitrust work has shifted since the 1970s, and the concerns that the government has, the things that it weighs when it's deciding whether to take action, have actually changed. And so that's been a action by the government that has, I think, that's been sort of unique to the United States compared to peer countries, that has affected might be one reason why we've sort of been uniquely affected by some of these developments.
Okay. I think we're going to raise the lights and go into our overall Q&A. We kind of segued there already, so hang tight.
Back to that one. Sure. Maybe.
Okay, I see a question down here. Go ahead, sir, and your name and state, please.
Brian Anderson, Connecticut. Robert, you kind of answered one of my two questions just now. If other Western democracies, other peer nations, have not experienced this decline in the middle class, could it possibly be related to the fact that labor unions are really suppressed in this country, and that in other Western democracies, workers have more bargaining power?
Yeah, so this is definitely a question that a lot of scholars have been very interested in, and there's been some really excellent work by many people on this. And I think that's definitely highlighted as probably one of the major factors that's contributed to this, both in direct terms, in sort of, bargaining power when the management and the workers are sitting down, who has what are the alternative options that each side brings to the table, and then also in terms of sort of more broadly shaping the political environment and the policy environment in which these decisions are being decided.
Kenan?
Yeah, I'll add, so not speaking to unions specifically, but I think that there's been kind of a shift in policy towards, or away from protecting workers. So one area is non-compete agreements. There was a really good article in the New York Times recently, and I don't want to pick on any states, but one Western state strengthened their non-compete agreements at the same time, or their provisions around non-compete agreements, which essentially make it illegal for a worker to go work for a competitor or even start their own business. So that's a real, to me that makes no sense at all unless you're just trying to protect your incumbent businesses, because it means that even low-wage workers, and including in some fast food chains, are now prohibited from going to work for a competitor for a little bit extra money if it gets on offer, or they can't spin out and start a new company in the same business line as their prior employer. So I think that is that some states are kind of working too closely with employers to say, employers say, we can't afford to have other people compete for our workers. I think that's nonsense, and that's not why people should be making policy.
Okay, I see a question here and maybe one coming. As you approach the microphone, sir, I will ask another question. We've talked about perhaps adjusting the tax code and taking a look at our policies for businesses. State legislators have great oversight of the education system. So kind of think about maybe a response to that. We'll go with your question and then bounce back to that thought. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Steve McCarter, State Rep, Pennsylvania. Is there anything in the research that indicates those states in terms of taxing policies and how they impact whether you tax your way to more dynamism or you cut your way to more dynamism? What policies and so forth seem to be more successful in terms of the states? Is there anything that you can add to that?
No, that's a good question, and I'm not an expert in state policy, so I could kind of comment to kind of broad regimes, but not the specifics. I think that, you saw that Western states are generally more dynamic. I think there's probably something to that tax model that might be worthwhile. But so on the other hand, some states like Colorado, they have difficulty funding their education budget, and they benefit from being a net importer of talent. If they had to grow their own talent, might not have kind of a strong enough education system to be as competitive as they are today. So there are some, I think, unique state-by-state considerations there. I believe that Connecticut is one of the least dynamic states in the Northeast, and that could come down to a variety of factors. Might not just be tax, but I think if you look at particular regions and then study their tax regimes, you'd be able to come up with some broad principles that might help inform.
Just briefly, one point on that related to some recent research that I'm familiar with. So one concern, as the difficulty with tax and budget is, of course, you have many things that you're trying to balance. And one concern that I think many people have is that if you increase taxes on very wealthy individuals, that you might scare them away, that they might move to another lower tax state, and that there might be tax flight. And there actually has been pretty thorough research on this at this point, most largely done by Christobel Young, who's a sociologist at Stanford, and basically finds that that does not happen to nearly the extent that you would expect. So people, tend to be fairly strongly rooted in their communities and don't necessarily want to leave just because their tax bill goes up.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Joyce Elliott from Arkansas, and I live in Little Rock specifically, and we have quite a history that some of which we're not very proud. So my question is really kind of place-based about the South, and particularly Robert, since you're interested in sociology. Arkansas is one of the states that's least dynamic, I noticed. And it seems that in the South, we are caught between two cliffs of hyper-segregation. We started out, we have an economy rooted in what was the old slave trade. And of course, we've progressed from that. And then on the map, it showed that since 1980, we have resegregated. In the 1970s, we did really well when we were forced to desegregate. There was a direct correlation between that desegregation and upward mobility. And I am living proof to that. I'm one of those. But when we got to a certain point, as we are now, we are resegregating, and now we're seeing a direct correlation between that resegregation and the downward mobility when it comes to particularly people of color. I can tell by concentration. So I'm wondering if you know any place-based things. Is anybody tackling this in this reality that you know about? Or is it just something you think is going to be a hopeless sociological construct that we're going to always fight to maintain?
Easy questions today. Easy questions. Go ahead. Who wants to go first?
Do you know of anybody that's doing anything? Could you start there?
I don't, but I'll keep mulling on.
Okay.
It may come to me while
Okay.
I'm here.
All right.
But I think that, you do have, especially the South is, well, history lives on
Complicated.
today. We see in all these maps. And I think where you have these kind of concentric circles of disadvantage, where you have people segregated by race and by income level and all that, it becomes even harder to break down the walls and kind of create just one kind of smooth, cohesive American polity that rises or falls together. So it's, it has to be front and center in all the work that you all do, but I don't know anyone that's got it right, because these are just extremely difficult issues. I don't want to say they're intractable.
Yeah. Well, I don't mean to just pick on the South. I just picked because that's where I live, because I am well aware it happens right here in Boston, Chicago, and every place else. Well, since I didn't get an answer to that question, let me give you another quick one. I've been wondering if we are maybe need to rethink how we define the American dream. Are we putting ourselves in a bad position, even resource-wise, if we continue to always push our kids to be more upwardly mobility than we are? Can we sustain that? Should we be disaggregating just who it is that we're talking about that needs to be moving in an upward mobility way? I'm pretty sure if my son lives the same quality of life that he grew up with, he's going to be pretty damn well okay. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure about that we need to keep pushing that. So just talk to me about that.
Thoughts, Robert?
Yeah, sure. So on the latter question, I guess I would say that I think we have to make sure that if we're going to, I think we should be pushing for improvements in standard of living, and especially I think we should be targeting those certainly to the the people who need to move up the most. But I think that as we try to improve our standard of living, we should definitely not make any sacrifices in terms of making sure that this is going to be sustainable. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges, but a very, I believe, solvable one is how do you have increases in the standard of living that don't deplete the earth or don't pollute our environment, and that are socially sustainable as well. And I think that's I think we have to make sure that when we're moving towards this, we have the economy set up in a way that we're going to favor those solutions that are long-term sustainable. And I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't be able to do that, I guess. Getting back to the first question, I guess there's a couple, I also don't have any magic bullets or anything like that, but a couple of sort of observations. So first one, this is going back to one slide I had about sort of characteristics of societies that have high rates of upward or downward mobility. I think that there's definitely a feedback process here where places where there's broadly shared prosperity, where people are moving up, becomes much easier to be more sort of generous or more open-minded, all that sort of thing, which in turn probably facilitates the next round of upward mobility. So once you have it, I think it can be easier to sustain, but that of course doesn't solve the problem we're facing right now. One aspect that certainly comes is important in all of this is housing and access to quality housing, access to affordable housing, and that sort of thing. So certainly this is something that states and cities can do is, either policies to encourage the development of more housing that's affordable and that's affordable with access to good schools and access to jobs and access to, stores, all that sort of thing. Or also, policies to allow people to move to a wider range of housing options based on the incomes that they have.
Cannon?
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive. I'll leave it at that.
Great. I think we're getting close. We have time for one or two more questions. So go ahead, sir. Your name and your state, please.
Jason Gellender, legislative staff from Colorado. My question is on the lack of dynamism in new startups. Have you guys or anyone else controlled or just the factor of an aging population in that, and as people get older, they become more risk averse, and how much is that tied into the distribution as well? Can be simply tied to age of a population in a given area.
It is tied in, yes. I don't remember exactly what % of the decline it explains. It doesn't explain all of it, but it's a portion that, so yeah, as our demography kind of ages and slows, that the startup rate slows as well, but it's involved, but not the entire puzzle. There are all sorts of little micro explanations that start to explain bits and bits of it, but the kind of other forces are working in the background as well.
Okay, and a final question over here on our left. Once
Hi,
again, your name and your state.
Hey, I'm John Jameson. I'm from Washington, D.C. And I want to talk about a different income inequality and make some parallels. I was at Harvard Business School from '89 to '91. And anyone who's old enough to remember that time, every week all we heard was, in 25 years, Japan's economy was going to be bigger than America's. It's laughable now, but that's what people thought. But there was this guy named Robert Reich, who was a professor at the K School, and he would go around, he would ask a question to people. He'd say, would you rather see a world where Japan grows at, say, 5% and the U.S. grows at 3% a year? Or would you rather see it where we're both the same at 2%? And a lot of people would answer that emotionally. They'd rather both of us be held down low, even if it meant just so U.S. would continue to be number one. And this makes me think about the income inequality issue. We talk about income inequality as being the problem, but it's really not a problem that Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or LeBron James makes more money than us. And that's what inequality is. It's the people at the bottom are stagnant. So do you even think, is income inequality, is that a word, is that a useful word for us to use, or should it be just concentrating on how do we lower people up at the bottom?
Yeah. Sure. So Yeah, so great question, and definitely interesting to contemplate what we expected back in the day. So as far as income inequality versus income stagnation, so I guess two things. So one, I would say, I think I would agree that the major problem, so the big problem that over the past 40 years in the United States is not necessarily who's growing faster than who else, it's that wages have not grown hardly at all for the vast majority of the population. So that's a problem of stagnation, and I think probably a source of much of the anger isn't necessarily that my income is growing less quickly than Jeff Bezos, but rather that my income is not growing hardly at all or growing very little. So that said, I think we also need to make sure that we're asking, when we're trying to evaluate, how do we feel about some of these billionaires, we have to ask sort of how were they able to see such a huge income, and to the extent that it's due to things that, sort of protection of incumbent firms or states, clamping down on competition, that sort of stuff, then I think that those are causes of inequality that I think we ought to be very concerned about because they are also directly contributing to wage stagnation.
I think that's where I land too, that it's going to be useful as long as it's not kind of the result of pure market outcomes that we can all say, like, yeah, that's fair. I think that the kind of professional athletes and a few tech billionaires who have created new and wonderful things or who sell their service to hundreds or billions of people across the globe are used to kind of justify income inequality that does not have as kind of benign origins in the U.S. economy today. So until we fix some of the other problems, I'm happy using it. But it's absolutely right that income inequality is kind of a catch-all that's not always, or it's worth asking specifically what people mean.
Well, we asked for some policy options to consider to round out the discussion, and I think we've achieved that. The conversation will continue. Would you join me, though, right now in thanking our panelists? And a kind reminder that if you're interested in the slide presentations, they are available on the app, or if you go directly to ncsl.org, I'm sure that they will be made available there, as well as the live-streamed event. Thank you so much, and enjoy this afternoon's Doris Kearns Goodwin.